when I started coding about 20 years ago, I didn't suddenly just start writing tests straight away. I'm going to put my hand up now and say that there's more code that I've created that is untested than there is out there that is tested by a long shot. And even today, I still don't write tests for everything. There you go. I've said it now. I've said it. So let's go right back to the start. So when I started learning to code, when I wrote my first line of code, there was no automated tests to back that up. So let's say, for example, that was a hello world thing. So I wrote hello world in PHP, and then there you go, printed that to the page, refreshed the page, and it said hello world. That is a test. That's a visual test. But there wasn't an automated test to check if the page returned a 200 OK, if the page had the right HTML elements, if the page had the text hello world, none of that. And I don't think anybody starts with learning to code with that mindset of I'm going to test whatever I do first. So test-driven development, no. When you start learning to code, you don't learn test-driven development. And so I think that everybody starts on the back foot when it comes to learning how to automate your testing and how to write tests, because you're learning how to code first, and then you're learning to test later, and then you're learning to test your code before you've written the code in a test-driven development kind of way. So it's a mental shift. It's a complete sort of head change that you have to do when you learn testing. Because no more are you writing code that is untested. You want to write tests before you write the code in a test-driven development kind of manner. But anyway, that's moving on quite far. Let's go back again to when I started learning to code. So for a very long period of time, we're talking many, many, many years, none of my code had any kind of automated tests whatsoever. And it was all visual. And when I was working at agencies and stuff, there was no tests there either, okay? As a junior developer, I didn't write any tests at all, which is very shameful. It's not a great thing to admit, but that's just what happened. And then I started learning testing, and I'd started learning testing off of my own back. So this is self-teaching. So I wasn't taught testing at university. I wasn't taught testing in any of my courses that I did. I learned testing through trying to work out how I can fit testing in my workflow. And I hated it. I absolutely hated testing. I resented it. I thought the people who were talking about testing were snobby programmers who had huge amounts of time on their hands. That isn't the case at all. I hated it so much that there was lots of opportunities where I was considering dropping it, where I was going to go, you know what, there's no point in writing any tests because this is just pointless. I don't have time for this. I'm actually making my code even worse by writing tests. And I think that a lot of developers get into that headspace as well when they start learning how to automate your testing. Because you can test code in a good way and you can test code in a bad way. And when I was learning the differences between unit tests, functional tests, integration tests, acceptance tests, API tests, all those kind of things, all those tests, and sort of trying to navigate what is the difference between a unit test and an acceptance test. You know, what is the difference between a functional test and an API test or an integration test? When I started out, everything was completely and utterly jumbled. So my unit tests were more like acceptance tests or functional tests. And when I started learning mocks, that was just a complete jumbled mess. And I spent far more time trying to test my code than actually write my code. And unfortunately, some projects suffered for it. And unfortunately, if let's say we had a project that lasted for 3 months, the first month and a half would be very tested, heavily tested. And I would probably test the wrong things. But the last month and a half, when it was actually crunch time to get the project out the door, it was at that time, the crucial time, where I didn't test because I didn't have time to test, because I didn't give myself time to test, because I didn't appreciate the amount of time is required to test your work. And of course, back then I wasn't doing test-driven development. I was testing after I wrote the code. So I wrote the code, wrote the test, discovered that the test failed, then fixed the code, then ran the test again. But the thing that really, really annoyed me with testing is the fact that it kept identifying areas of the code that couldn't be tested because the code stank. It was badly written by me. And so I could see quickly the importance of testing, but I hated it because even though the code worked and I could visually refresh the page and see that it had updated and done what the client wanted it to do, I couldn't test the code because the code was in a horrible state. That's the thing. You can write terrible, terrible, terrible code and still have your project work. But terrible, terrible, terrible code is really tricky to test.